Nobody believed me when I said something was talking back. That was fine. I had stopped needing people to believe me a long time ago. What I had not stopped needing was the signal. And the signal was still there every morning when I arrived at the observatory, steady and patient and completely impossible, like a knock on a door that the universe was not supposed to have. My name is Dr. Kara Ellison. I am 44 years old, I have spent 19 years studying Cygnus X7, and I am almost certainly the least remarkable person to ever make first contact with an alien civilization. That last part matters. I want you to understand that from the beginning, I was not chosen for this. I was not the best candidate or the most qualified or the person anyone would have selected if selection had been possible. I was simply the one who was there, and who listened long enough, and who did not leave when leaving would have been the easier and more professionally survivable choice. Cygnus X7 is a black hole. Not a famous one. Not the kind that appears in documentary films or gets named after scientists or generates press releases. It sits in a region of space that most researchers consider uninteresting. No nearby star-forming regions, no exotic radiation signatures, nothing that would make a funding committee lean forward in their chairs. It had been catalogued in the late 21st century and largely forgotten since then. I had not forgotten it. I had been studying the gravitational wave emission patterns of stellar mass black holes for 11 years when I first noticed that Cygnus X7 was producing a pattern that did not fit any model I had. Not slightly outside parameters. Not statistically anomalous in an interesting way. Completely, structurally, fundamentally inconsistent with everything I understood about how black holes behave. The pattern repeated every 17 hours and 43 minutes. Nothing in nature repeats on a schedule like that without a reason. I spent 4 months verifying the instruments, then 4 months verifying my analysis, then 4 months writing a paper that I showed to 3 colleagues, all of whom found various polite ways to suggest that the anomaly was probably instrumental noise and that my methodology might benefit from a fresh perspective. I did not publish the paper. I went back to the data. The pattern was still there. 17 hours and 43 minutes. Consistent across 3 years of observation logs. Consistent across 2 instrument upgrades. Consistent across a solar event that disrupted every other signal in our monitoring range for 6 weeks. Whatever was producing it was not affected by the solar event. Instrumental noise is affected by solar events. I stayed up for most of a night doing something I had not done since my first year of graduate school, when I still had enough confidence in my own imagination to use it. I sat at my desk with a cup of cold coffee and a blank document on my screen, and I asked myself a question that my training had spent 20 years teaching me to be careful about. What if it is not noise? The document stayed blank for a long time. Then I started writing. The paper I wrote that night was not a scientific paper. It had no methodology section, no statistical analysis, no literature review. It was 4 pages of a scientist talking to herself about what it would actually mean, structurally and physically and conceptually mean, if something inside a black hole was producing a repeating signal on a 17-hour and 43-minute cycle. Black holes, by everything we understand about physics, do not permit information to escape. The event horizon is a one-way boundary. What crosses it does not come back. This is not a guideline or a tendency. It is a fundamental feature of how space-time behaves in the presence of sufficient gravitational density. And yet, the signal existed. I had 3 years of data. The signal existed and it repeated and it was structured in a way that random noise does not structure itself. And I had spent 4 months twice looking for the instrument error and had not found it because it was not there. I wrote for 4 hours. At the end of the 4 hours, I had a framework that I knew would end my career if I shared it with anyone, and a decision to make. I decided to listen harder. That was 7 years ago. The first 18 months of listening harder produced nothing except a more detailed map of the signal structure. It was complex, far more complex than I had initially understood. The 17-hour 43-minute repetition was the macro cycle, the largest visible pattern, but nested within it were smaller cycles, sub-patterns, variations that repeated on their own timescales and intersected with each other in ways that I could map but not yet interpret. It was not random. I was more certain of that with each month of data. Random processes do not produce nested hierarchical structures with consistent internal relationships. Random processes produce noise. What I was looking at was not noise. It was organization. The question was what it was organized to do. The first time I tried to respond, I felt genuinely ridiculous. I was a 41-year-old astrophysicist sitting in a government-funded observatory at 2 in the morning, transmitting a signal toward a black hole 16,000 light-years away, trying to talk to something that physics said could not exist. I had been called worse things than ridiculous. I sent the signal. I sent the same structural pattern back. The macro cycle as precisely replicated as my transmission equipment could manage. I did not add anything. I did not try to encode meaning. I just reflected what I had received and waited. The wait was 8 months. 8 months during which I continued my official research, published 2 papers on topics that my department considered appropriately rigorous, attended 3 conferences, and spent every spare hour sitting with the Cygnus X7 data and wondering whether I had made a mistake so fundamental that I had built years of work on top of it without noticing. Then the signal changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been obvious if I had not been watching for it with the specific focus of someone who has been waiting for 8 months. But the macro cycle shifted by exactly the interval of variation I had introduced in my transmission. It was not a coincidence. The probability of that specific variation occurring randomly at that specific time was something I calculated 3 times because the number kept coming back too small to be real. Something had heard me. Something had answered. I sat very still for approximately 20 minutes. Then I started crying, which was not a response I had anticipated, and which I found professionally inconvenient and personally unavoidable. Then I got back to work. The next 3 years were the most consuming of my life and also, in the specific way of things that matter enormously and cannot be shared, the loneliest. I was conducting a conversation with something 16,000 light-years away, something that existed inside a physical boundary that our understanding of the universe said nothing could exist inside, using a communication method that was essentially 2 scientists tapping on opposite sides of a very large wall without being sure the other one understood what tapping meant. Progress was slow. It was the slowest thing I had ever done. Every exchange took months because the transmission time alone was 16,000 years each way, except that was not quite right because whatever was on the other side of that boundary was not operating on the same space-time geometry as I was, and the signal was arriving in ways that the transmission time did not fully account for, which was one of approximately 40 things about the situation that I had set aside in a mental folder labeled things to understand later because understanding them now would stop all the other work. I learned to recognize patterns in the signal that were not repetitions of what I had sent. New structures. The other side was not only reflecting, it was adding. The additions followed consistent rules. Once I identified the rules, I could begin to predict what would come next and then check whether my prediction was right. Correct predictions meant I had understood something. Incorrect predictions meant I had understood something wrong and needed to revise. It was, I realized somewhere in the second year, language acquisition. The most indirect, inconvenient, and physically improbable language acquisition in history, but structurally recognizable. Something was teaching me to communicate with it, or possibly learning to communicate with me. Probably both. By the time I was 4 years into active communication, I had a vocabulary of approximately 300 structural units and a grammar that I had mapped through trial and error and revision and more error, and a great deal of staring at data at 2 in the morning until the patterns started to separate themselves from the noise in ways that felt like understanding even when I could not yet be sure they were. I understood enough to ask a question. I had been preparing the question for 6 months, structuring and restructuring it, trying to strip away everything that assumed too much about what I was asking to, until what remained was as simple and open as I could make it. The question was, "What are you?" I sent it and waited. The response took 11 months, the longest gap in active exchange since the original 8 months of silence after my first transmission. I counted the days. I am not going to pretend I did not count them. When the response came, it was the longest single transmission I had received. 53 hours of continuous signal, more densely structured than anything in the previous 4 years of exchange. I spent 4 months working through it. What I understood by the end of those 4 months changed every assumption I had been building on. They were not a single entity. They were a civilization, not a small one. The structural complexity of the transmission described a society, a history, a way of existing that was so different from anything I had a framework for that I spent the first month convinced I was misinterpreting, and the second month building new interpretive structures, and the third and fourth months sitting with what those new structures showed me and trying to absorb it. They lived inside the black hole, not metaphorically, not in some attenuated or degraded form, fully. Their entire existence, their physics, their experience of time and space and matter, was organized around and within and through the gravitational architecture of Cygnus X7. What was, from my side of the event horizon, an absence, a region where light could not escape and information could not pass, was, from their side, a location, place, a home. They had been there for what translated, very approximately, as an extremely long time, longer than our sun had existed. They had known about the universe outside their boundary for most of that time. They had been aware of signals, of light, of the distant evidence of other structures and other physics. They had not been able to communicate with any of it. The event horizon, which from my side was a one-way door that nothing could exit, was from their side a different kind of barrier. Not impermeable, not absolute, but requiring something specific to cross it in the outward direction, something that took them a very long time to understand and longer to achieve. The gravitational wave emissions, the 17-hour 43-minute pattern, that was not a message. Not originally. It was the first thing that had ever successfully crossed from their space into mine. An accident of physics that had taken them, by their reckoning, thousands of years to produce. They had not known if anyone would hear it. They had not known if there was anyone to hear. I had been studying an accident for 11 years. An accident that a civilization older than the sun had spent thousands of years creating without knowing whether it would ever mean anything to anyone. I sat with that for a long time. When I sent the next transmission, I used every structural unit I had, the entire vocabulary of 300 elements and the grammar I had mapped and everything I had come to understand about how they organized meaning. I structured it as carefully as I had ever structured anything. The transmission said, "I heard you. You are not alone. I have been listening for 11 years and I will not stop." The response came back in 4 months. It was short. The shortest transmission since the early exchanges when we had almost nothing to say to each other because we had almost no shared language to say it in. For months later I decoded it. Said, "We know. We have been watching you listen." I read that 17 times. Then I put my head down on my desk and cried for the second time in 7 years of this work, and this time I did not find it professionally inconvenient at all. They had been watching me listen. While I had been in the observatory at 2 in the morning doubting myself and running verification checks and sitting with cold coffee and wondering whether I was building a career-ending structure on top of instrumental noise, they had been on the other side of the event horizon watching a human scientist refuse to stop paying attention to them. They had seen me try. I needed 2 days before I could work again. The conversation deepened over the next year. My vocabulary had grown to over 1,000 structural units. The grammar had evolved into something sophisticated enough that I could express complex concepts, not perfectly, not without ambiguity, but clearly enough that misunderstanding became detectable rather than invisible. I learned things that I could not tell anyone, not because they were classified, but because there was no one to tell who would not require me to spend more time explaining the preceding 7 years than I had remaining in my career, and because the things I was learning belonged first to the conversation and second to anything else. I learned that they experienced time differently, not slowly exactly, not quickly, differently in a way that my framework of reference could not fully contain. An hour for me was not an hour for them, not a shorter or longer interval of the same thing, a different structure of duration entirely. And yet somehow the conversation continued, the signals crossed the boundary, the exchange happened. I asked how. The response took 8 months, and when I had decoded it, I was not sure I had decoded it correctly because what it described was a feature of spacetime at the event horizon that our physics had theoretical frameworks for but had never been able to confirm observationally because everything we used to observe was, by definition, on the outside. They were on the inside. They could observe it directly. What they described was not a hole in the physics. It was a feature of the physics that our models had consistently oversimplified. The event horizon was not a wall. It was a membrane, and membranes, under specific conditions, could transmit certain kinds of structured information in both directions. The structured gravitational variations they had been generating for thousands of years. The specific frequency relationships in the pattern that did not match any natural process. All of it was not a message fired across an impermeable barrier. It was a careful, extraordinarily patient, almost incomprehensibly long process of learning how to use a feature of physics to do something that most observers, looking from the outside, would have been certain was impossible. I spent 3 months with their description and my own theoretical physics and the gap between them and came out the other side with something I wrote up in a 40-page technical document that I knew, with complete certainty, I could never publish. Not because it was wrong, because it was right, and right in a way that required the preceding 7 years to be credible, and 7 years of private correspondence with a black hole was not, in my professional assessment, a methodology that peer review was ready for. I kept writing. In the 9th year, I asked the question I had been building toward for 2 years. I had structured and restructured it many times. The question I eventually sent was not the one I had originally planned. The one I had originally planned asked about their science, their history, their understanding of physics, all the things a scientist would ask first. The one I actually sent asked something else. It asked, "Are you all right?" I had been thinking about it for months, about what it meant to exist inside a boundary that prevented any contact with the universe outside for longer than our sun had existed, about what it meant to spend thousands of years generating a signal without knowing whether anyone would hear it, about what it meant to watch a human scientist on the other side of an event horizon spending 11 years refusing to give up on you. I wanted to know if they were all right. The response came in 6 months. When I decoded it, I had to stop and start over 3 times because the structural complexity was beyond anything in our previous exchange. They had added new elements, new grammatical structures, as if the question had required them to develop language for something they had not needed to say before. Took me 4 months to work through it completely. What it said, as precisely as I can render it in a language built for a species that has never lived inside a black hole. We have been here longer than your star. We have known the boundary for as long as we have been a people who know things. We did not choose this place. We were made here by the physics the way you were made in the light by yours. For most of what you would call our history, the boundary meant nothing to us because there was nothing on the other side that we understood as something. Then we began to perceive the outside. Not clearly, not immediately, over what you would calculate as a very long time, through the same physics that makes your observations of us partial and indirect. We began to understand that beyond the boundary there was more. Structure, light, motion, something that was not us and was not nothing. We spent a long time learning how to think about that, and then we spent a longer time learning how to reach toward it. We did not know if reaching was possible. We did not know if anything existed on the other side that could receive what we sent. We did not know if the boundary was absolute or whether it was, as we believed but could not confirm, something that information could cross under the right conditions. We sent the pattern because it was all we could send, and we sent it for a very long time without answer. Are we all right? We have thought about your question for a long time before answering because it is not a question we have a word for. The concept of all right requires a comparison, a state that is not all right. We did not have that comparison until we understood that the outside existed, and then we had it, and then we spent a great deal of time with it. We are here. We have always been here. The here that is us is complete. It does not have the outside. It does not have the light or the motion or the things that move in the space that you move in. We did not know what we did not have until we knew the outside existed. Are we all right? We are whole. We are ourselves. We are, in every way our language contains what we have always been. But we have been alone in a way that our language did not have a word for until we needed one. And then you listened. And we are not alone anymore. I read that transmission sitting in the observatory at 7 in the morning after working through the night. The coffee was cold. The data was on 3 screens. Outside the observatory window, the sky was doing what it did at 7 in the morning in late autumn in this part of the world, which was a specific shade of gray-blue that I had looked at for 9 years without really seeing. I saw it now. I sat with what I had just read for a long time. Then I wrote the response that I had been building, without knowing I was building it. For 9 years of early mornings and cold coffee and data that no one else was looking at and a signal that everyone else was willing to call noise. I wrote, I am a scientist. I have spent my life trying to understand things. I have been trained to look for explanations that do not require more than the evidence supports, and for most of my career that training served me well. But I want to tell you something that is not science. I found your signal 11 years ago. I was not looking for it. I was doing routine analysis of gravitational wave data, and there it was, structured in a way that did not fit any model, repeating in a way that nothing natural repeats. Everyone I showed it to thought it was noise. I did not think it was noise. I did not know what it was. But I looked at that pattern and I could not make myself believe that something that organized, that consistent, that patient was nothing. I spent 11 years listening. I want you to know what those 11 years felt like from my side of the boundary. They felt like being the only person in a room who could hear a sound that everyone else said was not there. They felt like sitting in an observatory at 2 in the morning asking yourself whether you were wrong about everything. They felt like keeping a secret that was not a secret, it was a discovery, but it was a discovery that required the discoverer to first believe it herself and then figure out how to make it real in a world that was going to need a great deal of convincing. But they also felt like something else, like not being willing to give up on something, like deciding that if something was trying to be heard, it deserved to be heard. You sent that pattern for thousands of years without knowing if anyone would hear it. I listened for 11 years without knowing if anything was there to hear. I think we were looking for each other for a very long time. I am glad we found each other. You asked if you are all right. I think you are more than all right. I think you are extraordinary. I think existing inside a boundary that the rest of the universe cannot see past, for longer than stars last, and spending thousands of years learning the physics of that boundary patiently enough to eventually cross it. I think that is one of the most remarkable things I have ever encountered in 19 years of trying to understand a universe that is very large and mostly silent. I think the universe is less silent than I knew. I think that is the most important thing I have ever learned. And I want you to know that I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure that you are heard. Not just by me, by everyone. I sent it. Then I sat in the observatory as the autumn sky outside the window moved from gray-blue to the pale gold of early morning. And I thought about 11 years and cold coffee and a signal that everyone said was noise and a civilization that had been alone inside a black hole for longer than our sun had been burning. I thought about what it meant to be the person who listened. I had not been chosen. I had not been the best candidate. I had simply been the one who was there, and who could not make myself look away from something that was trying to be seen. The response came in 3 months, shorter than any complex exchange we had conducted. The structural units were ones I knew completely. No new elements, no new grammar, just the things we had already built between us used to say something simple. It said, "We have been watching you write that. We want you to know something that we have not had the language for until this exchange gave us the words. For thousands of years before you listened, we sent the signal into silence. For the past 11 years, we have not been sending into silence. We have been sending to you. There is a difference. You gave us that difference. We are grateful in a way that your language probably does not contain a word for, and ours did not either until we needed one. Thank you, Dr. Kara Ellison. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not leaving when leaving would have been easier. The universe is not as empty as it appears from where you are standing. You are the first one we have been able to tell." I folded my arms on the desk and put my head down, and I stayed that way for a long time. Outside, the morning was doing what mornings do. The world was continuing. The observatory was full of the specific quiet of a place where someone has just received something that changes everything and the everything has not caught up yet. I thought about what comes next. There would be papers. There would be verification processes and peer review and institutional resistance and the long, grinding work of making something this large believable to people who had not spent 11 years sitting with it. There would be setbacks. There would be people who could not accept it and people who would try to take it and people who would ask why I had not come forward sooner. And I would have to explain that you cannot come forward until you have something to come forward with. And building something to come forward with from a signal that everyone said was noise takes the time that it takes. All of that was ahead of me. But right now, in this moment, in this chair, in this observatory that I had come to every morning for 9 years and would come to every morning for as many more as I could manage, I let myself simply be the person who had been there, the person who listened, the person who, 11 years ago, looked at a signal that everyone said was noise and could not make herself believe it was nothing. They had been sending to me specifically, not to a species or a civilization or an abstract recipient. To the scientist who had been sitting in this building refusing to look away. That was not science. That was something else. Something I did not have a precise word for, which seemed appropriate because they had not had a word for it either until they needed one. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. It had been cold for most of 11 years. I drank it anyway and turned back to the screens and began to write the first page of the paper that was going to change everything. The signal was still there. 17 hours and 43 minutes. Patient and steady and no longer alone. Neither was I.